You may have thought that there would be a pause in women's basketball between the WNBA finals and the start of the college season, but think again, it's 11 days of the FIBA World Cup 2022, and we're here to talk about it all right now.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone. Happy Monday, friends. It is September 26th, 2022. I am Missy Heidrick. I'm the National Women's Basketball Correspondent for the Next, and so happy to have you here with us. Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Missy Heidrick, and be sure to follow this podcast at Locked On Women's Basketball, and of course, everything at the Next at the Next Hoops. September is always a weird month because it's kind of the end of the WNBA season. Congrats to Las Vegas on their championship, and we await college basketball to kick off. But the 2022 FIBA World Cup is off and running down under in Sydney, Australia. We've got the rundown on Team USA and their qualifying round games, international stars who are shining on this stage, and then what has to happen for Team USA to get that gold medal next weekend. I am so happy to be joined today by Isabella Rodriguez, one of the outstanding journalists that covers women's basketball at the Next and beyond. She's been reporting on this 2022 FIBA World Cup and is here to give us all the news and notes, and we dive right in. All right, Isabel, let's just set the stage for everyone so they kind of understand how this World Cup works. 12 teams, they're in Sydney, Australia. They're broken up into two groups, Group A, Group B, 6 teams in each. Everybody has qualifying rounds, then it heads to the knockout round. Let's just dive in a little bit, first off, and look at the two groups, kind of how they have been separated, what stands out to you, and then we'll talk a lot about Team USA in just a moment.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's great to be on here with everybody. I'm really happy to be on the podcast. I think this is my first one, which is kind of cool.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, we can just run through the two groups. So in Group A, which is arguably the less competitive group, but I feel like has slowly turned into the more competitive group over kind of the course of the World Cup, despite how competitive or like how close the teams are in Group B. For sure, you have Team USA, which at this point is kind of in a class of its own. Right. The US have really put up performances, including the one that came last night, which broke a ton of records in terms of high scoring for both Team USA in the World Cup and also the World Cup itself, with 145 points, I believe it was. So they just are out of this world, and it's clear to me, at least, watching them play, that this is not even 10% of what they could possibly do. So their output on the offensive end, especially, is just astronomical and really hard to understate. On the defensive end, though, I think that's where Team USA have kind of let a couple of things slide. They did give up, I think it was 69 points to Korea yesterday, which was about the same that they gave up to China and also to Belgium when they played before. So really not able to put in as much defensively as they might have liked to during that game. So I think that'll be a focus for them going forward, especially as they're already in the quarterfinals. They already have that spot locked down, and they're most likely going to be that top spot no matter what happens. Unless China has another couple of blowout wins, which I sincerely doubt, right. Especially since the last game the U.S. has is against Bosnia and Herzegovina, which we will talk about in just a second. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that's kind of the trajectory for Team USA, is just making sure that they can lock down that defense and really figure out what went wrong on that end during the game against Korea. Otherwise, in Group A, China is the next top player. China has really put out a good showing, I think, especially against the U.S. Despite losing to the U.S., I think they really put in a good effort. Meng Lee, I think, has been a particularly good standout to me. I've really enjoyed watching her play. She's an excellent outside shooter, which they definitely need with the size that team brings. Making sure that they can kick the ball out and actually have someone to make shots from the perimeter is really nice. So having her there has been great. And then obviously Han Zhu has been killing it, tearing it up on both sides of the floor, and just putting in really impressive performances on top of the starting lineup that they're able to bring. So China, I think, is one to look out for. Belgium would have been on my list as well if it wasn't for Emma Miesemann going down with a calf injury earlier today, I believe. Well, I guess today Eastern time, yesterday Sydney time. But she exited the game against, I think it was Bosnia, early in the third quarter. It looked like a non-contact injury. Our Jen Hatfield is digging into that at the moment to see really what's going on. But it looks like she's going to miss the rest of the World Cup and potentially extended time after that. So
that's a huge blow for them. I mean, just really because she was the focal point, really what they built that Belgium team around, not to have her. And they had a very competitive game against the United States. I mean, that was an 87-72 win for the U.S. People say 15 points but when you look at some of these other scores, that was one of the more competitive games that Team USA had to deal with. And so when you take a player like that out, it really does change what they may be able to do going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, even in their game against Puerto Rico, which they basically scraped by with a 3-point win, I mean, I have to wonder how, because the injury was non-contact and because it was so immediate, I have to wonder if she's been playing with that pain and with that injury for a long time, because she really has looked a little bit more stagnant than she normally does, which, I mean, at least I'm just happy that this at least gets her some rest. She's talked about how intense the schedule is, and so
everybody deserves that rest. Real quickly, let me ask you about Group B, because in Group B you've got Australia, Canada, France, Serbia, Mali, and Japan. And now, if people that want to flip their dial back and go to the gold medal game at the Olympics, the United States beats Japan 90-75 for that gold medal win. Now, again, this is a very different Team USA, but it seems to me that that's going to be a team that's going to be circled on the list as we start heading forward. What have you maybe seen out of Japan? What have they brought to the table here in these first few games at the World Cup?
Sure, yeah. So I think Japan at this point, I believe with that loss to Serbia this morning, I think it was this morning, or just kidding, they played Australia. No, France, sorry. So many games are going on. There's 6 games every day, so my brain's a little bit all scattered. But they lost to France earlier this morning. And so I believe that has officially prevented them from getting into the quarterfinal, which I think is really pretty staggering for folks, especially coming out of that Olympics. I mean, they had some pretty significant changes roster-wise. They've played really differently to how they played before. I wouldn't be surprised if we see significant coaching changes going forward as well. So yeah, I think it's looking more in depth at what happened between the Olympics and now is a really interesting story to follow, and especially what the aftermath is going to be in terms of who we see come back and who does it. So one player, or at least a couple things that I will say about Japan that I liked and that I enjoyed seeing is that, like, especially because they had a lot of offensive struggles and they really just couldn't get shots to fall. But Maki Takada, who was one of their only inside threats, she just put on a really good defensive showing, and she was always giving 110%. She had some really impressive blocks that I had to go and watch back, and just was giving a really good effort. So I think she's my standout from Japan, but it's really hard to pinpoint someone else who was really as consistent and delivered, to be honest. And so yeah, that one I think is a really interesting case study. Same goes for Mali. I think folks expected a lot more out of them than they were able to give, although to be fair. I mean, they came in pretty last minute. I think they were the ones replacing Nigeria after Nigeria had to pull out because of their basketball federation basically messed up and prevented them from joining the World Cup, and then retracted it, and it was this whole thing. But yeah, so Mali lost 4 of its games of its 6, so is officially out of the running as well. But I think there is a lot of potential with them, especially with Sika Kone, who I believe is with the Liberty. I could be wrong about that, but she's been drafted, and so she'll be in the WNBA at some point. I'm like almost certain of. But they just really needed to find some other folks to put around her. We've seen, especially, I mean, Bosnia and Herzegovina is another good example of this, but just one player teams, or teams that are centered around 1 or 2 players, just really struggle in this tournament because of the pace, because of the number of games. I mean, you just watched Jonquil Jones in the last game that she played, like she looked exhausted. And it's because she's playing so much time, and because they really rely on her as their primary piece. And while Mali is a little bit different, they have tried to set up an offense that's more balanced. I mean, it's still going to fall on the players that have the most talent on that roster to put up the points, and it just hasn't been enough. So.
Absolutely. Okay, so in just a moment, we talk about rosters, and for those that have been following, and they know that this Team USA roster does look different. So we can dive into that in just a moment. It is a very new look for Team USA, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment, along with some of the other star power that we are seeing in the World Cup. But first, betonline.net is your #1 source for football betting information this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, in-depth articles, and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including MLB. The playoffs are right around the corner. MMA, boxing, golf. We had the President's Cup last weekend. It is going to kick back up on the PGA Tour. Head to betonline.net to use your mobile device to learn more. I reside in the state of Kansas, where betting is now legal, and you're going to have a hard time finding anybody that I know that on a weekend isn't on their phone and on an app, especially BetOnline, checking scores and seeing what they have down. So BetOnline, where the game starts. Hi, everybody. I am Missy Heidrick, and thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. I am here with Isabella Rodriguez. We are talking all things 2022 World Cup. Sydney, Australia, down under. The time change has us thrown off because we think some things are when they are. But regardless of time change, Isabella, let's talk about this Team USA, because this now is Cheryl Reeves' team. This is group. She has put this together, and it looks very different. Now, there are, I believe we've got 5 players that are on this roster that were part of the Olympic team, but a lot of new faces. And I think that is, you know, I feel like that's where Team USA and USA Basketball has to move, is that this has to be, we have to start thinking about that next generation of player that can have long-term success, that they're able to, be able to contribute for multiple years, multiple, whether it's World Cups, Olympic teams, etc. But when you think about Cheryl Reeves and the way she likes to play, I feel like this roster and the star power around it is what's starting to find its footing. And I think they're doing that here in these first few games of the World Cup.
Definitely. Alex Simon, who's over at Bay Area News Group, and I have been doing some of these late night, we've been watching some of these late night games over on playback. I think one thing that we've consistently talked about is just how many new faces that Team USA has brought to this World Cup event, and what that means for what the roster will look like for the Olympics and for future Team USA events. And just like by nature, and this is something that Alex says a lot and that I've echoed, is just that by nature of bringing so many new people, you're going to naturally have people who this is their first and maybe last event with Team USA. And so I think it's interesting to watch the minutes distribution that Cheryl has put through. Last game, I think it took until the early fourth quarter for us to see anything from Sabrina Ionescu. She just hasn't seen all that much on the floor. Same thing with Brianna Jones has been a little bit more limited, although she did put up a huge line yesterday despite that. And so I think just seeing who the main folks are that she tends to rely on, and then who comes off the bench most frequently has been really interesting to watch.
Well, and we go back to that, and so for all of this, say, okay, well, tell me the 5 names. All right, Brianna Stewart, Ariel Atkins, Chelsea Gray, Jewel Lloyd, Asia Wilson. Those are the 5 players that were part of the Olympic squad that are on this roster for Cheryl Reeves. But as we said, a lot of other new names. Now, a player like Kelsey Plum, she had an outstanding season for the Aces. They won a WNBA title. She arrives in Sydney a few days later. But let's keep in mind, she also won an Olympic gold medal in the 3-on-3 at the last Olympics. So she is not someone who is brand new to USA basketball in the international scene. I think one of the players that I was surprised at that has not only been on this roster, but maybe an impact type player is Shakira Austin, the rookie. Ole Miss had a fantastic season, a breakout year in the WNBA. She gets that double-double versus Puerto Rico with 19 points and 10 rebounds.
Huge.
And all of a sudden, this just looks a little bit different than maybe it has in the past. But I have a feeling that that's what Cheryl Reeves is after, that this has to be that next evolution of what Team USA and what USA basketball looks like.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. I mean, just looking at the folks that she has put on her starting lineups has been really interesting, especially because we talk a lot about in women's basketball and basketball in general, this idea of positionless basketball and moving away from traditional positions and traditional like a true 5 or a true point guard, moving away from those set positions to people who can be flexible and move within positions. I think honestly, especially because of the turnaround, having so many players that can play at multiple spots and really be able to change their mindset from one second to the next has been really beneficial for them. Because I mean, this team hasn't been together for like at all. In its final form has really you're putting players that were playing against each other in the WNBA finals on the starting lineup in Alyssa Thomas and Asia Wilson and Chelsea Gray. And so like there's no further antithesis of what those two teams were doing in the WNBA finals to then have them come over to Sydney, Australia on this huge time difference, and to have them play as well as they have is just remarkable. Like there's no other way to put it. It is like astounding to watch how well that they've been able to transition.
Well, I think that goes back to, there's a lot of talk. And I think if there's some outstanding documentaries and things that have looked at the evolution of USA basketball on both the men's and the women's side. The one that came out this summer about, the women, and I believe it was the 96 team under Tara Vanderveer. But there's always been this back and forth as it relates to collegiate players and the professionals. And if you think about it, for a long period of time, there wasn't a group of professional basketball players on the women's side that you could go to until the late 90s, that was really even something, because most players were in Europe. They weren't really available. We can talk about the men's dream team because they could go to the NBA and pluck those best players. It was simplistic. The women's team and that evolution has changed. But as you said, I could look at players that stood across from each other at jump in the NBA finals now on the same roster and think, but you know what, you're pro. Like, this is how you've got to be able to get this work done. We know they were given a playbook, literally had to get Wi-Fi on the plane on their way over to go over the playbook. Hats off to them, because that is a pro, somebody that's able to show up and get the job done.
I mean, just one story that's related to that I think it was Alexa Philippou, who's over at ESPN. She mentioned this at some point earlier, but Asia Wilson came in before this game, like just a couple of not even a full day ago, I think at this point. And she came to the first practice that she was able to get to. And Cheryl had described her as kind of woozy, not totally sure of not because of the Aces celebration, but because of the fact that she had to get all of these plays together and have a handle on what was going on. and was to the point that she kind of accepted coming off the bench and having a limited role. Her first game back puts up 20 points, 8 rebounds. Yeah. Like the turnaround that is expected, like even when it's not expected, the turnaround that they end up producing is like, I have no words, which is bad for a podcast, but
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask you real quickly about two players that I know jump off the page on other teams. Both of them on squads that are in Group B, of which the United States and Team USA most likely will match up with possibly at some point when they head to the knockout round. Kean Nurse, a household name for WNBA folks, and played at Connecticut. She returns to Team Canada this year. Also, two other players, two Minnesota Lynx players on that Team Canada, in Bridget Carlton and Natalie Achonwa. That's an interesting storyline. But also Lauren Jackson. She returns to Australia and to the Opals. Just real quick before we talk more about Team USA and how they head to that knockout round, what kind of impact do you see those players having?
Oh my goodness. I mean, Bridget Carlton the last couple of games has just been phenomenal. I mean, she is like the rock that Team Canada really has needed. I mean, they have Nira Fields, who has put up consistently great performances, but she's more of an outside threat. She's kind of like a Kalia Copper type of really getting into the basket, but doing so off the dribble, and really taking those open lanes. But Bridget Carlton, I mean, she's as steady of a shooting guard as well as an inside threat that you could possibly get. And especially combined with her defensive capabilities, I mean, she's been excellent the last couple of games. And has been a large part of why Canada, up until today, was 3-0 with no losses in a really competitive group, especially with their team kind of coming together, also kind of like Team USA, kind of last minute. So yeah, Bridget's been. I have no notes. So yeah, and then Natalie Achonwa, I think we haven't seen a ton of offensive production from yet, but her defense has been pretty key to Team Canada as well. Kean Nurse, obviously, she's coming back from an ACL injury. This is her first time playing since the playoffs last year, so she's taking it slower to start, but she's been there in those critical moments for Team Canada, which I think bodes well both for her ability to continue playing through the rest of the Cup and well into the WNBA season next year. I think you can be pretty pumped about that. Especially if you're a Phoenix Mercury fan and there's not a ton to be pumped about. That's definitely one story that you can get excited about. And then on top of that, I mean, she obviously brings such energy to that Canadian team, and so having her on the floor has been really nice to see. So excellent stuff from Kean Nurse.
You got it. Absolutely. All right. In just a moment.
Do we want to chat about Lauren Jackson, or do you have?
We'll talk about Lauren in just a moment. But first, what I want to do is we're going to talk about Lauren Jackson, and we're going to dive right into the road to that gold medal and what that looks like for Team USA and what they've got to do down under. Hi, everybody. It's Missy Heidrick, and I am here, Locked On Women's Basketball and the Next. Thank you for joining us. Isabella Rodriguez, before we talk about Team USA, let's talk about Lauren Jackson. You know, she has been a name that has been synonymous with the international firepower of this Australian team for many, many years. I think a lot of people who have followed the WNBA, they know her and the impact that she has had. What kind of, I always feel like veterans are such a calming force, especially in an international competition. And it seems like that's really maybe one of her biggest roles, is that she just brings so much experience to the floor that if there's going to be a game where they get 15 minutes out of her, or they get 35, just having Lauren Jackson on the floor and part of this team is a huge thing for Australia.
Absolutely. I mean, she hasn't really played all that much, which is to be expected. She's 41 years old. Yeah. So as much as you can get out of her is excellent. But weirdly, she's turned into a pretty good outside shooting threat. She went 2 for 4 from 3 today, and hit some pretty critical 3-pointers that helped Australia prevail over Canada, which was a huge win for them and ended up securing them that spot in the knockout round. So, I mean, she's had limited minutes, but in her limited minutes has been really, really a good force for them. And I think, to your point, has been really steady for them, especially as they dealt with Rebecca Allen going down with injury, and some pretty chaotic opening moments. That first game was maybe one of the sloppiest performances I've seen from them in a while. So having her there as kind of a force for calm and collectedness has certainly helped fuel their comeback, I would say.
All right, let's talk about Team USA, because as they go for a fourth consecutive gold, the last was in 2018 in Spain. Now, I think as we do the math, everybody knows that there was no World Cup in 2020 because of COVID. So therefore, that's why there's been this big span. We had the Olympics last year. The Americans come home with the gold medal after that win of Japan in the gold medal game. As you look at the games that has happened so far, as you said, it's kind of been this up and down. That we've seen some like fantastic and just obliterating offensive performances, some really good defensive performances as well. But it is now we're getting to crunch time, where if I'm Cheryl Reeves and she's got her coaching staff together to say, okay, now we've got to put it all together. We've got to have both the offensive firepower and the defensive firepower come together. I think every player on this roster has a role. They're each going to have, whether they're going to be more of a defensive stopper or a scorer. But 145 points scored against South Korea last night, I guess in Australia, or however we want to do that. Their last game, we'll just say that. So coming from that and heading into the knockout round, I feel like this Team USA really is hitting their stride.
Oh yeah. I mean, you have to be feeling pretty great after beating like 2 records in one game, and basically covering the spread for that game all by yourself. I pretty nearly did that. So I mean, there's no other way to put it. You have to feel pretty great offensively. The US have one more game in this preliminary stage. That'll be versus Bosnia and Herzegovina today at midnight. Alex, Simon, and I will be back on Playback to talk about that. So feel free to join us. The link is probably in our Twitter bio or something like that. But that is sure to be probably another blowout win, to be honest. I mean, Bosnia has already been eliminated from the knockout round, so they're really just trying to at least put something out on the floor. I am happy that for this last game, Jonquil Jones is going to be able to hang out with her friends. She'll be able to see Alyssa Thomas and Brianna Jones again, and just really go out with a bang. So I'm expecting good things from JJ in this game. But I mean, yeah, I think this is really a time for the US to finalize those rotations and really get a handle on what their go-tos are going to be for the knockout round. I think last game, I mean, we went from 21-21 tied halfway through the first quarter to like well over 50 points scored by the half. So, I mean, the US really figured out like who they need to bring in if they need a refresh during that Korea game. And so really finalizing that sort of roster adjustment, maybe trying a couple of other things out, I think will be what we see from them in this last game. And then heading into the knockout stage, I mean, it really depends on who they draw first and when. If you're the US, I mean, I think you're looking for, I mean, whatever you can really get. I have no doubt that they could put together a good showing against any number of these teams. I think their toughest opponents that have qualified are China. Obviously, that was the toughest game that they've had so far, probably. Even then, it wasn't the hardest game ever, but still, it was. And I think China will have a lot more motivation to beat the US in the playoffs for sure. So there's at least that. Canada, I think, would also be a tough matchup for them, despite their loss to Australia today. Canada really has it together on both ends of the field in a way that I don't think most teams do. Except maybe Australia after today, to be honest. They've really turned it around recently. But yeah, they're just a really well-balanced team, which I think, I mean, the US is well-balanced in a way that is like unreachable for anyone else at this point. But Canada at least has that aspect to them where they're not relying on one or two players to really go off in order to get them the win. So that would be one that I would be interested to see. And then Australia is another one. They qualified for the final today. So we will see them somewhere, somehow. And they're similar. I think even though Rebecca Allen has gone down and we don't know whether she'll be back for any part of the World Cup after this, I sure hope so.
Right.
She was a really, really great piece for them. But even without her, I mean, there have been some really key pieces that have stepped up in her stead, Stephanie Talbot being one of them. She had a near triple-double today, which was pretty crazy to watch, especially given, she played pretty limitedly offensively in Seattle. It was more of a defensive stalwart, which it still is here, but just to see her explode pretty much offensively was really, really impressive. And then obviously Izzy Magagor is a star in every sense of the word. So Australia would be another interesting matchup for them to get early on in the knockout round.
Well, I think scheduling is, as you mentioned, one more game for the United States in the preliminary round. Then they head to the knockout round. Scheduling is going to be a big factor. I think rest comes into that to be able to get some of these players who just haven't had very much simply because of the playoffs, the travel, all of the above. More time for them to spend together, maybe going over strategy, breaking down film, which I know the coaches are going to be looking into. One player we haven't talked a lot about that I just want to mention real briefly because obviously she's one of the very best in the game. And I think Breanna Stewart is between one of those players that when Team USA needs somebody to put them on their back, she's going to be that kind of player. She had 22 points in that Belgium win. And sometimes what she does on the floor is incredibly quiet. You don't always see it. It might be a big rebound here, or simply because she draws attention, she's going to open the floor for other players. But it seems to me that a little bit about how Breanna Stewart and Asia Wilson go, Team USA is going to go here as they head into that knockout round and looking to get to that finals, which is on October 1st.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see a lot of Breanna Stewart in this upcoming preliminary game. It looked like she was wearing one of those like fancy back heating pad contraptions after she came off of the floor during their last game, which she only played like she didn't play a lot in their last matchup against Korea. And so, yeah, I mean, again, just rest wise, I wouldn't be surprised if we just don't see her all that much or at all tomorrow or this evening, I guess. But yeah, I have no doubt that she'll make a reappearance for the finals. And especially given just how efficient she's been able to be even with her limited minutes. I mean, she scored, 18 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists in 13 minutes. So there's just like there's no stopping her when she's on the floor, no matter how long she's on the floor for. And so I think even in limited minutes, she could make a really big impact for them.
Yeah. If I'm Cheryl Reeve, I'm going to have a hard time figuring out a way not to have her on. So you've got to, as you said, you got to use your time wisely, get her some reps if she needs it, but be ready for the rest of this knockout round. And the 2022 FIBA World Cup Finals will be on October 1st. There's going to be all sorts of action in between them. And as you heard just a little bit ago, you can catch Isabel and others on playback tonight, watching the next Team USA game as they play Bosnia-Herzegovina. So other than finding you at playback tonight, where does everybody find you on a daily basis?
I'm pretty much always on Twitter at Isabel Barroso 78 is my handle. You can find me at The Next. I write our newsletter that is, I guess, less daily now, but it was daily during the WNBA season. And so you can subscribe to our newsletter for free over at thenexthoops.com. And you can also find me at the Daily Princetonian, which is the Princeton newspaper. I write about women's basketball there, as well as a number of other women's sports. Yeah, Princeton women's basketball is always a joy to cover. They are electric in ways that few other Ivy teams are.
Well, I'm the college basketball person through and through here. That's my house. I tell everybody on a daily basis. So I love to talk Ivy hoops, which means you and I are going to do it more often, especially once we hit October all the way through March.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you to everybody out there for listening and watching and for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen every day. I am Missy Heidrick. with the next hoops. You can find me on Twitter at Missy Heidrick. Follow this podcast at Locked On Women's Basketball and at the next hoops, because we will keep you covered. Please join us all this week for more episodes. I'll be here tomorrow with a look of the news around college basketball, including conference schedules are getting released. We've got news on transfer rules, all of the above. But also, don't forget, more FIBA World Cup 2022 coming. We will keep you up to date, and it is all right here on Locked On Women's Basketball. Now, make your second listen Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Josh Lloyd hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching. We will see you next time right here on Locked On Women's Basketball.